Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me and welcome to Top 10 Rock Albums of 1992, of which I consider to be the last great era of rock. As we all know, 1991 grunge exploded, alternative rock and all that stuff came in and really changed the landscape of what rock and roll was. You know, it had a great run through obviously the 60s, but into the 70s, huge. Into the 80s, it started to morph and change, and by the early 90s, rock was all but dead. Now, when I say that, what I really mean, of course, is that it went underground. But 1992 was the last big year where albums were still on the charts, these bands were still having hits and holding their own amongst all the other changing musical scenes and so forth. So we're going to count down the top 10 rock albums of 1992. But of course, before we get started, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like. All those things help support my channel. I would greatly appreciate it. Of course, as an added bonus, if you turn on notifications, you're going to stay up to date on really cool episodes just like this with top 10 rock albums of 1992, the last great era of rock. Now, before we get started in this, I just want to sort of clarify, I am leaving out heavy metal, thrash, things like that. So those bands are not in here. We are talking about rock bands with the word rock in and title of what they do and so forth. Now, I do have an honorable mention because I really worked hard to narrow this thing down to 10, but there were just so many great albums from that era. So I did want to give a shout out to Australian rockers INXS and their album Welcome to Wherever You Are. It was their 8th studio album at the time. This one here was much more raw sounding than their previous one, which I think is one of the reasons I really liked it, but they also experimented a bit more in it. They added sitars and orchestra and stuff like that to it. So there was kind of a new sound to it, and I think it was a great bridge from what they were doing in the 80s into the 90s. Still had some pretty big hits on it for them. Baby Don't Cry, Not Enough Time. So again, the band was still in the mainstream and so forth. Ultimately selling 1 million copies in the US. So regardless of whether I like it or not, it was successful at the time kind of a thing. But a lot of these albums here, I want to point out that even though it was 1992, and like I said, grunge had already hit and was killing off all the rock bands and the glam metal and all that sort of stuff, a lot of these bands still held their own. All right, so here we go. Starting with the number 10 for our top 10 countdown, Bad Company, Here Comes Trouble, 10th studio album from the band, and 4th since the reunion. This reunion had Brian Howe as the vocalist. He had also sung for Ted Nugent, did a great album with him. But where Bad Company was originally more of a blues rock band, this version of Bad Company focused more on the melodic hard rock, the AOR, that sort of stuff. Regardless, they had quite a few hits with the Brian Howe era. And I always kind of find it interesting how Bad Company today is essentially trying to squash this era of the band, yet it was huge in the 80s and into the early 90s. This album here had hits off of it like How About That and Here Comes Trouble, and ultimately the album was certified gold. So again, still having a great presence for the 1992 time frame. Next one up, Fleetwood Mac guitarist Lindsey Buckingham coming in at number 9, Out of the Cradle, his 3rd solo album, but it was his first album since leaving Fleetwood Mac back in 1987 when he had recorded Tango in the Night, my favorite of the Fleetwood Mac albums. And this one here really kind of continued on with that sound and style. He had been recording it from 88 to 92, but I think it carried on that sound of the 80s, even though it ultimately came out in 1992. Happens to be my favorite album, too, by Lindsey Buckingham. I would say check out tracks, because I don't really know what was a hit at the time kind of a thing. This one really kind of flew under the radar. Ultimately not receiving recognition, not making big sales or anything of that nature, but Countdown, track number 4 in here happens to be my favorite. I love Surrender the Rain, track number 12, and track number 14, Turn It On. So if you're unfamiliar with this album, highly recommend it. Really, really good stuff. Coming in at number 8, one of the alt rockers doing it up right, The Cure and Wish. I absolutely love this. Their 9th studio album. Most commercially successful too. Ultimately, it would sell 1 million copies in the US. You know, still firmly rooted in the alternative rock and the goth rock, which they all started. But this album here really had much more of a lighter side to it. It was more airy, a bit happier, if you will. But it was also more guitar driven, and I think that was the thing that pulled me into it when it came out. And of course I went back from there and found out that I liked the rest of this stuff, but I think it's also what helped this album be the commercially successful album it was. Having the massive hit with Friday I'm in Love, one of their lighter, happier, airier songs. Ultimately, the song would be a top 20 hit, going to number 18 on the Billboard Hot 100. I think that might be their highest charting hit. The album as a whole, though, is so good. While not a lot of overall hits, that song was massive, but the other ones, not so much. I do really like the song High, which was the first single that came off of this album, and they had some other good ones, but from start to finish, the album is so good. It plays like it's all hits, meaning it's a very consistent album all the way through. Which is why I'm placing it where I do here at number 8 in my countdown. There was a 30th anniversary 3 CD edition of this that came out last year. So if you're a fan of this album like me and you love it as much as I do, that one is totally worth picking up. Coming in at number 7, REM, Automatic for the People. 8th studio album from the band, third one on a major label, and follow-up to the massive 1991 album Out of Order. This one here kind of continued on that experimentation that had started out on the previous one. They used different instruments and things of that nature on here, including adding strings. What I found interesting was the person who arranged it was former Led Zeppelin bassist John Paul Jones. He did that for a lot of the 80s rockers and stuff like that. So the band kind of moved away from that indie rock sound that they started out on and went with that more experimental sound from Out of Time, continuing it on here. Despite the band not touring for this one, in fact, they didn't tour for the album before it either, it would go on to sell 4 million copies. And at that time, that was kind of a crazy thing because it was the tours that promoted and made albums sell. Whereas today, it's a little different. Bands release an album to promote a tour because they make the money at the tour. But back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s, all of that, it was always about promoting an album because that's where a band's money came from, livelihood. Some of their best loved songs are on this album: Drive, Man in the Moon, Everybody Hurts. My personal favorite is The Sidewinder Sleeps Tonight. But just a great album from start to finish on this one. Okay, coming in at number 6, Great White, Psycho City, 6th studio album, and last on a major label for the band. Regardless of it being 1992, though, Great White seemed to not know that that was the year. I mean, this album sounds like it was recorded in 88 or 89. They just maybe didn't get the memo that the decade had changed, but so good, and it's held up so well against the rest of their catalog. Once Bitten, Twice Shy in 87 and Twice Shy, or sorry, just Once Bitten from 87 and Twice Shy in 89 are absolute classic albums. Personally, my favorite is Hooked from 1991, but I love that trilogy of albums there. This one here, I think, is just as good as the material on that. If you gave up on Great White after Hooked, definitely go back and check this out. Might not have reached the sales numbers from their previous albums, but it was just as good, featuring the title track, Psycho City, Step on You, Old Rose Motel was awesome, and the single that came off of it did get some good radio play at the time, Big Goodbye. You might even know that one if you check it out. Okay, what was a new band at the time? Coming in at number 5, Gin Blossoms, New Miserable Experience, and it was actually their 2nd studio album, although this was the first on a major label. The previous one was indie label cassette only release. It would later get that was dusted, would later get a CD release. But at the time, this was kind of like their debut album coming out, at least for the regular market. But when it came out, it had very little fanfare, kind of lackluster reviews as I understand it. But about a year later after its release, it really exploded behind the single, Hey Jealousy. That was the one that I knew. It just grabbed me from the moment. I couldn't believe how great it was. So many other good songs on here. Another huge hit, Found Out About You. My personal favorite, though, was Until I Fall Away off of the album. But again, just the whole thing, absolutely amazing. It would go on to sell 4 million copies at the time. And a rock and roll revival band coming in at number 4, the Black Crowes, Southern Harmony and Musical Companion, their second studio album. For this one here, the band added 2 new members at the time. Mark Ford on guitar, which I always enjoyed his presence in the band, and Eddie Harsh on keyboards. So the band for this really dove deep into that sort of rock and roll revival sound, playing this straight up rock sounds. And I don't just mean like hard rock. I mean, they were like doing the Rolling Stones, the Faces, stuff like that, which they had started on the mega selling previous album, Shake Your Money Maker, but they really kind of dove into it here. And it's actually my favorite album from the band. They had, some still major hits off this thing. Sting Me, Remedy, which was a monster hit, Thorn in My Pride, Bad Luck, Blue Eyes, Goodbye. I liked other songs on the album. Hotel Illness and No Speak, No Slave, I think is great. Ultimately, the album would go on to sell 2 million copies, which is by far, no slouch for the time frame. So just again, that's the idea behind this, the sort of the last great era of rock, where rock still held its presence in the mainstream. That's sort of the point to why I'm telling you the album sales on a lot of these things. While some of these, went through under the radar, that sort of stuff, other ones were quite monsters. Okay, then we've got New Jersey's own Bruce Springsteen doing 2 albums, Human Touch and Lucky Town. So album number 9, album number 10, he released them on the same day, which is why I'm including both. So I guess technically this is a top 11 of the great rock albums of 1992, but I'm considering it one. And even though they were sold separately, to me, it's a double album. And they entered the Billboard charts in positions number 2 and number 3, respectively. So just showing you how great they were. Human Touch was much more introspective. It had a more somber element to it. Title track, Human Touch, Cross My Heart. I really liked the third song, 57 Channels. That was the one that actually got me into it. When I heard that as the single, which I think was the second single off the album, and I bought the CD single at the time, and it had a B-side, Part Man, Part Monkey. Great B-side that was unreleased for a long time until they put it on a box set. But just good stuff all around. And Lucky Town had a much more carefree, it seemed to have be about life and possibilities and things like that. So the song's Better Days, A Leap of Faith, and I absolutely love the song If I Should Fall Behind. I think it's a beautiful song. It's a great wedding song. If you need one, use that. The 2 albums, though, really do complement each other, and again, that's why I'm considering them one thing here. Of the 2, though, I think most of you guys know, Lucky Town is my favorite. That one there is just an amazing album. I can play it start to finish all the time, no matter what. But depending on my mood, I really can go either way on it, because I do like that dichotomy between the 2, the introspection versus the positivity type effect. Each one would sell 1 million copies, so 2 million total sales between those 2. Coming in at number 2, Def Leppard, Adrenalize, their 5th studio album, first to be recorded without longtime guitarist Steve Clark, who unfortunately passed away right after Hysteria. So this would be recorded as a 4-piece, and is so far the only album to be recorded as such. I think the band made a really good attempt at growing with the times, modernizing a little bit, but they retained what it was that was successful about Hysteria. Still had those layered guitar sounds and so forth that were on here. Full of big hits. Let's Get Rocked, Tonight, Have You Ever Needed Someone So Bad? Personal favorite of mine, Stand Up, Kick Love Into Motion. Then you've got other ones that were on here that I think were released as singles in other parts of the world and stuff, because I know there's music videos for them that ultimately turned up on home videos and stuff like that. Heaven Is, and I Want to Touch You. So I have seen videos for those things, but they were not released in the US, at least as far as I know. I never saw those things on MTV and stuff like that. The band had probably, the time frame had probably fallen off by that point anyways. And so while not as massive as Hysteria was, this album did sell 3 million copies, which was a pretty big feat in the 92-93 era for which this album came out and was toured and promoted and so forth. All right, and coming in at number 1, the boys from New Jersey, Bon Jovi, Keep the Faith, fifth studio album from them, produced by Bob Rock, who of course we know has worked with Motley Crue, Metallica, so that was a big deal when he had come in and working with them. Probably one of the reasons the album was also as good as it was. Last to feature all 5 original members of the band. It was a very strong album for them, really showing the band growing. They dropped that glam metal element that they had, the 80s rock sound, in favor of a much more mature sound on this, and it just worked. But this is just one of many times that Bon Jovi has been able to reinvent themselves to really great successful effect. Stellar moments on the album include In These Arms, Bed of Roses, Blame It on the Love of Rock and Roll, which was not a single on this one here. But for me, again, the album is just amazing from start to finish. It would go on to sell 2 million copies, again, keeping Bon Jovi in the limelight. Part of that 1992 last era of great rock. And there you go, top 10 albums from 1992. I'm sure you guys have albums. There were so many other great ones by like Neil Young and Harvest Moon, and just other ones that I couldn't include in here. I had Peter Gabriel's Us on the list for a while, and unfortunately some of these had to get bumped. But let me know which ones you guys liked the best. Let me know what you would do as your top 10 or your number 1 on here, and we'll have a great discussion about it. All right, everyone, take care, have a good one, and I'll talk to you real soon. Bye-bye.